massive thank you to Dr. Peter Levitt. Please, another round of applause for him. And now I have the pleasure of properly introducing you to today's lead of the event. So, Dr. Siobhan Mitchell. Siobhan's background is in dance. Training vocationally in ballet, she developed an interest in health and well-being. Siobhan completed her MRes in health and well-being and was awarded an ESRC studentship in 2014 to complete her PhD exploring the psychosocial implications of maturity timing for children growing up in elite dance training contexts. Siobhan has worked with the Children and Young People's Mental Health Research Collaboration since 2018 at the University of Exeter and currently works as a research fellow on 2 projects. The Children and Young People's Social Prescribing for Mental Health project, which aims to extend the growing evidence base around social prescribing in primary care and public health areas by focusing on its use for children and young people, and the GuiDANCE project, which we're going to be speaking about today. Siobhan has a powerful gift and a singular focus for young people in dance. Her focus on health and welfare for young dancers has influenced teacher training, dance education, and awareness among teachers, dancers, and dance teacher training organizations across the UK, and indeed around the world. Her contributions are both extraordinary and world-leading, and we're so lucky to have her with us today. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Siobhan Mitchell.
If you could just describe a little bit about yourself, perhaps how you started dancing.
Yeah, so my name is Matthew Astley. I'm currently with English National Ballet. I started dancing, so I have a twin brother who has dyspraxia, and my mom was watching one of my sister's modern classes and she thought it might be a good idea for him to join to help with his coordination. So being twins, I got forced to go along. Joined in and instantly fell in love with it. And I had a teacher that saw some potential in me, and she said I should join the RAD ballet classes. So I joined that, and I did that for 4 years. I auditioned for the Royal Ballet School and I got in, and then I did 8 years with the Royal Ballet School, and then I'm currently in my 12th year as a professional.
So if you think back to your experience growing up in dance, and we're sort of focusing particularly on that experience of adolescence during dance training, I guess, how do you remember that experience?
It was nice to be around people that had the same admiration for dance that I did. And then you go into a group of people where you're kind of the special dancer at your little school, and then you go into the big pond, and I think the tunnel vision that you have to get through it with all the aspects of competition come into play and all the assessments and stuff. And I have some incredible friends. I think that was definitely a positive that came through it. These are, like I was saying, my family now, which is amazing. But there's also the stress of constant appraisals and always trying to meet that next goal and trying to get that next role. And I think growing up as a teenager, it's hard enough as it is, and then you've got the added pressure of trying to find yourself as a ballet dancer and trying to fit a mold, and in that teenage body, which is ever growing and ever changing, trying to understand what that means for yourself and for your development as a dancer.
Is there an example, or perhaps 2 examples, one positive, one negative, where you feel that that dance aided or supported a healthy adolescence, or where dance perhaps made it more difficult or more uncomfortable?
Yeah, I think definitely a positive was making me feel almost valid, that my artistic self had a space to create and to truly be myself. that was an amazing experience to go through with my classmates. I think negative, I think we're really in that ballet bubble, which is such a small community, and I think it can be quite overwhelming when it becomes your whole life and your whole goal. And I definitely had a few struggles along the way with the way my body was changing and trying to fit what I thought that was needed to be a ballet dancer from my teachers, or even from myself, the pressure that I would put on myself to try and achieve those goals.
If you were going to give some advice to your younger self, or possibly, would that be the same advice as you would give to youngsters today?
Ooh, probably. I think I would say just remember why I started to dance. It's simply because I genuinely love it and I have so much passion for it. And I think that kind of got lost along the way in some spaces. Just to enjoy it and not be afraid to make mistakes, to look silly, look stupid. I think those are definitely the times where I grew the most, is when I made the biggest mistakes. Trying to reach that perfect image wasn't ever going to be achieved, and that's the art of it. It's the imperfections that make it a special art form. So yeah, I would say, yeah, just enjoy it a bit more.
Yeah. And if you think about your teachers who you had during that period, is there anything that you feel that was particularly important, or a particularly important experience that's either stayed with you or that you learned from?
Yeah, I was very lucky. I had many great teachers. These were teachers that I almost idolized. They were people that had done exactly what I wanted to do. Many of them had been principals with big ballet companies and had many great stories from when they were dancing. So definitely you kind of hang on every word that they say. And I think some of those words can really stick with you. What can be, like I was saying, like a small seed can grow into a big tree. I gained weight as a 13-year-old boy. And you know, looking in the mirror every day, you become very self-conscious of it. And I remember a lovely teacher, just very, as a passing comment, said, "Oh, you know, you've got bulky thighs, so you know, we'll be careful with that." And that stuck with me until right at the beginning of my career. I would think about it constantly, about, you know, how did I look, and you know, were my thighs going to be too big in a costume? So yeah, I would definitely say that these students really do. You know, I listened, I appreciated everything my teacher had to say, and I think sometimes the comments that seem so insignificant can make a huge impact on a student's life.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing from you that teacher was not approaching you negatively
Not
at all,
yeah.
and was a supportive experience.
A really lovely teacher.
Yes,
yeah.
And yet that tiny little thing stayed with you so powerfully.
Yeah, and I'm sure it was on me with my insecurity, but I think in the ballet world, it's a space that, you know, we're so hypercritical of ourselves that it's so easy to take something that can be a positive, you know, not a negative message, and you make it negative for yourself. So yeah, it definitely stayed with me for quite a while.
Do you think your experience of adolescence was different to that of your brothers who were not in dance?
Definitely. I think we had to mature quickly at a young age. I think sometimes it was easy to forget about the bigger picture when everyone around you wants the same thing. You almost think that that's the only goal and the only thing that you should be trying to achieve, on top of everything else with academics and just being a teenager. He was able to explore a bit more of who he was as a person. You know, he didn't decide what he wanted to do with his career until he was much older than me. And for me, it was trying to fit into how I can fit into the ballet world and how I can fit into what I thought was the mold of being a perfect dancer.
Do you think that made you more mature or less mature, I guess, psychologically or emotionally?
I think emotionally,
how did that work? Yeah,
not as mature.
Right.
I think I always say that dancers grow up very quickly and then you stay quite immature. Yeah, I think it took me a while to develop who I was as a person, not being a dancer and to try and separate myself from being a dancer, and to know that I had worth outside of my job and what I was trying to excel at.
If you wanted to leave the GuiDANCE network a message, what would that be?
Just that I think, these students really do hopefully appreciate all of the teachers, and I did it with every teacher I feel impacted me, not only as a dancer, as a human, as a growing teenage boy, and how much where students are developing as people, emotionally, physically. There's so many different aspects that come into it, and I think that dancers just want to kind of feel somewhat normal, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
So, back to me. Sorry if you can hear some of that. We'll have to fiddle with it and see what we can do with that later. But we will also be sharing that on our site and things, so there'll be other opportunities to engage with that. So, thank you to Peter for the fab keynote, getting us moving, getting us ready for the day, and thank you, Aaron, for the lovely intro. I will be talking just a little bit today about the evolution of this piece of work. It sort of spans the last decade of what I've been doing in this space, so kind of how we got to where we are today, basically. So, as Erin mentioned, my background is in dance. I did full-time training and I very much grew up in dance, so I definitely have some appreciation for the sort of challenges of growing up in dance. And as I went through my university studies, I got more and more interested in the sort of science of the dancing body and how we might support dancers a little bit better. So, fast forward to 2013, this paper, those of you who have seen me speak before will have seen this paper. This paper is the catalyst for everything that I have done in this space ever since. So, I read this paper, it really resonated with me, talking about the differences of experience growing up in dance and not in dance. And they were looking at the timing of puberty and whether this had any impact on psychological well-being. So as you'll notice, this paper is from the 1980s. So I got really interested. I thought, I wonder if there's something that's been done more recently. This seemed to me like a really important thing to be looking at. And I couldn't find anything. So I did some more reading in this space. I found quite a lot of research around sport and growth and maturation, and quite a lot of papers from this guy. So this is Dr. Sean Mitchell. He was a researcher at my local university, and I thought I would make some time to meet with him and we could have a chat about this paper and I could ask him whether he knew of anything else in this space. So we met, we had a nice cup of tea and we chatted about the paper. He was very interested, but he hadn't seen anything else in this space for dance. But he encouraged me to pursue some research in this area. So, fast forward, I start doing some research in this area, but what was the sort of starting point? So, obviously, as I've described, what we had was quite dated, wasn't very much of it, and it very much focused in ballet at this point. So what were the key kind of things from the research that we did have? So first of all, social context is important. So the context in which you go through that pubertal transition, really important, unsurprisingly. The second key thing was that the timing of puberty was amplifying the importance of this social context. So for young people that went through puberty earlier, they experienced much poorer psychological well-being compared to their peers who went through puberty later, and much, much poorer compared to their non-dance counterparts. So this was really interesting to me. I'm going to rewind a little bit to talk a bit about what pubertal timing is, because I'll be talking about this for the next 20 minutes or so. So just so everyone is with me. So pubertal timing or maturity timing I will talk a lot about. This is what I was mainly interested in. So not just puberty itself, but the timing of when that happened. So when we talk about pubertal timing, we often sort of categorise it as early, on time, or late. And usually we kind of make sense of this by saying that those who mature earlier are going through that process of puberty a year or more in advance of the average, and those who mature late or in delay are going through that process a year or more in delay of the average. So the interesting thing about pubertal timing in human beings is that there's a massive, massive range. So our chronological and biological age can vary by up to 5 years. So that means you can have a 12-year-old who's very, very much a child, and you can have a 12-year-old who looks like a fully grown adult. Anyone who's seen me speak before will usually expect the picture of Tim Henman and the tennis player to come up now. I haven't wheeled that one out again, but it just shows that massive variation in between our chronological and biological age. So also interesting in terms of pubertal timing is how this is determined. So primarily this is genetically determined, so 50 to 80% determined by our genetics in terms of whether you go through that process early or late, but also susceptible to social and environmental factors. So things like chronic stresses such as famine, for example, would be likely to delay that process of puberty, or acute stresses such as exposure to threat or abuse would be likely to accelerate that process. So not something that's immovable, but largely determined by our genetics. So the last thing I want to mention about pubertal timing is one of the reasons why it's of great interest to me in the context of dance. So there are psychological and physical implications of this timing. So when you go through puberty has an impact on what your physique looks like. If you go through puberty later on, you have a longer period of time growing in childhood, which results in longer limbs relative to a shorter torso. And that's just because in childhood is when our limbs grow, and they spend a longer period of time growing in that phase. So unsurprisingly, that has great relevance for us in dance. So the papers that I was finding at this point in my research were pointing towards this huge bias towards later maturation. So the papers were sort of reporting 70% of professional female ballet dancers as being late maturing. So this was very interesting to me. I came away with lots of questions. We had not very much research, but what there was really, really interesting to me. Combined with my kind of background and my experiences of growing up in dance, I thought, this is definitely something we've got to look into a little bit more. But my interest was, because we didn't have very much to go on, my interest was really looking in a bit more of an exploratory way. So what I was interested in was perceptions and experiences of this process of growing up in dance. So I started off by talking to dance teachers. So if you look at the sort of research out there, no one had really talked to dance teachers about this before, and I knew from my own experience that they would have some great insights around this. So I talked to dance teachers. I wanted to understand what their perception of puberty was, what the perception of these sort of changing bodies and working with them in the context of dance was, and whether they thought that the timing of puberty was important. So dance teachers really described this process of puberty as this kind of make or break event. They described it as unpredictable, pivotal, inconvenient, unavoidable, and like Russian roulette. So really painting a picture here, a fairly negative picture, and kind of getting at some of the stigma associated with this pubertal transition in the context of dance. So we got past the initial kind of feelings about puberty in this space, and teachers talked about the kind of timing of puberty. So they did feel it had an impact. They felt it had an impact on whether or not that young person might have a future in dance, specifically when it came to things like ballet. And surprisingly though, there were still pretty mixed opinions about which timing was favourable, so early versus late. So we had some teachers who spoke about late maturation giving this nicer look. So we're getting at that kind of aesthetic here that sort of favours our late maturing individuals. This was the best bit for me. This was the really interesting piece. So quite a few of the teachers that I interviewed talked about early maturation maybe having some benefits. And this was not something my experience had told me would be the case, and this was not something that had come up in any of the other research that I'd looked at. In fact, you look at research in kind of spaces like football, and really we're kind of flipped around from that. So in football, it's really beneficial to mature early, for example, and in dance, it looked like it was very, very much swinging in favour of our late maturing individuals. So this was really interesting, this idea that getting the growing out of the way was really beneficial. So it meant that these young people went through their growth spurt, that most rapid period of change, before that most crucial point in their training. So this was really interesting. Also, some dance teachers just felt it was irrelevant and that it did not matter. So real range of opinions there from dance teachers, and the main thing that kind of was a light bulb moment for me was this idea around the potential benefits of early maturation. So, I start my PhD. I want to focus very much on sort of the perceptions of young people in dance. I was really interested in whether or not they perceive any benefits of early maturation and what their kind of experience was. And I was really interested in whether or not there were any social or psychological implications associated with different timing of puberty in this context. So, unsurprisingly, there's like a lot of findings from the PhD. I've kind of distilled it down to my kind of key takeaways. And I'm happy to talk in more detail later, but I'll keep it brief now. So, number one was this idea that dancers were describing this conflict between very normal changes of puberty, breast development, widening of the hips, all those kinds of things, and the perceived expectations of their environment. So these were young people training in full-time vocational ballet schools across the UK, and that was their experience. So this, very similar to some of the things mentioned in our video keynote, and also some of the things that are coming up in the media, just around the pubertal transition and the conflict between this pubertal transition and the kind of perception of what's expected and required, particularly in the ballet space. So dancers really described this sort of idea of there being a right and a wrong way to grow. So in particular, this idea that kind of staying the same and maintaining this kind of prepubescent physique was really positive, whereas change was pretty negative. So this was the kind of picture that young people painted in their descriptions of this experience. Key finding number two, so this is all about the kind of timing of puberty. So remember, I wanted to kind of understand more about young people's experiences relative to that different timing of puberty. So, did their experiences vary? So we found some further benefits in line with what our teachers had been telling us. We found some further benefits of early maturation. So young girls who'd gone through that pubertal change quite early were describing the benefits in terms of how they had a longer period of time to adjust to that change. Things such as growth-related injuries, all of those kinds of things, they were going through all of that at a time where there was relatively less demand and pressure training-wise. And so they had that period of time to adjust. There was also obviously significant challenges for these young people. They were very much in the minority going through these changes at that early stage of their training. But yes, they did outline these similar positives that the teachers were also telling us about. Really interesting, the late maturing dancers that I spoke to described a lot of challenges. So prior to this, we've got quite a rosy picture painted of late maturation, correct body, bit more kind of smooth sailing for these young people. But actually they described a lot of challenges. So things were quite negative for these young people. First couple of years of training, fantastic. I've got this wonderful physique and I'm being sort of encouraged and praised for this. And then during the most kind of crucial part of their training, they described going through that most rapid period of growth, growth-related injuries, struggling with flexibility, and just feeling a bit left behind. So that's interesting. I also want to return to this idea of a bias towards late maturation. Obviously, the data that we had, this 70%, was from the 80s. I wondered if things might have changed since then. We looked at maturity timing across the students of the 3 vocational ballet schools that we were working with, and we had 65% of the young people late maturing, so not a great deal of change there. So there is still this bias towards later maturation, whether that's self-selecting because you feel you have the right physique, or whether we are selecting for those bodies as well. Probably a bit of both. What's really interesting about this for me is that this bias towards late maturation really conflicted with the kind of training system that we have currently in terms of vocational training. So you've got the majority of your young people going through puberty quite late, but actually in terms of when the training demands peak, it's right at the wrong time for these young people. So my kind of summary from this was these differences are quite important for us in terms of providing appropriate support for young people as they're going through that. Understanding the differences in those experiences will help us to provide better support and more developmentally appropriate training. So a few more quotes here. I hope the contrast kind of works for you guys, but basically these first 2 quotes, these are from early maturing girls, and they're really sort of describing that kind of difficulty around the aesthetic side of things in that first quote. And in that second quote, really this idea of more mature bodies being less acceptable in this space. That is their perception. And in this second lot of quotes, these are from late maturing dancers, and this is really getting at that kind of idea that at the beginning, it was all quite good, and then actually they started having more challenges as they went through that period of growth. So things such as injuries due to growth, reduced flexibility during that growth spurt, and just generally feeling a little bit behind in those kind of final years of their training when they want to be auditioning and moving forward. Okay, key finding number 3. So very unsurprisingly for me, dance teacher was nearly always mentioned by all of these students in these interviews. They were mentioned as very, very much central to how they experienced this process, whether that's positive or negative. So through the dance teacher, these young people were learning about what's the sort of expectation around physical change at this time. Is there a right or a wrong way to grow? Their perception of that change as it happens to them, is this positive, is this negative? And also how well they coped with that. The kind of support and knowledge and understanding of the dance teacher was pivotal. So these couple of quotes sort of really outlining that. So this idea, similar to what Matthew was saying in the video keynote, this idea of small comments, reading between lines, things that stick with you. Whether or not there was that intention from the dance teacher, it's the perception from that individual in terms of what they take away. And the second quote is really interesting to me. This is the kind of idea that almost inaction can be as bad as action from the dance teacher. So the idea that not kind of addressing it or acknowledging it at all can be just as bad. So during my PhD, I focused quite a lot on the dance teacher. From those initial interviews that I did with teachers, I was very, very interested to kind of follow on with this. I was lucky enough to do a placement with Dance UK during that period of time, and we did a little survey. We basically wanted to understand dance teachers' perceptions of this as a topic, whether or not it was important, what they understood about it, what training and education they had received, that kind of thing. So from that survey, around 60% of dance teachers said that they hadn't had any education or training on the topic of growth, maturation, development. So this was a big kind of eye-opener for me. I thought, okay, there's lots to do here. But also really positively, nearly 90% of the people who responded to our survey really wanted to learn more. They wanted more resources, more support in this area. So that was encouraging. So in response to that, in my placement that I did with Dance UK, we made some information sheets, some workshops, we started to make some kind of educational resources in this space. And around a similar time, I went and spoke at the RID conference in Australia about what I was finding in my PhD, and that was the beginning of my work with them. So off the back of that, the RID asked that I kind of put together some CPD for them on this topic. And so that's where my engagement in the kind of teacher education space on this began. So, fast forward to 2018, I finished the PhD. I have many more questions than I started with, but here was my takeaway. So, teachers are telling us that this pubertal transition, this is make or break, this is really important, but we need more education and more support in this space. Dancers are talking about this kind of conflict between these very normal changes of puberty and what's being expected of them in the dance space, and they're also telling us that the timing of this has a bearing on their experience. As researchers, we would always love more data, but I really felt that this kind of gave us somewhere to start. There was definitely some actionable things coming off the back of this. So for me, this change starts with a few kind of key things. So the first one is a drive for more and better data. So in order to make some more kind of evidence-based, informed kind of recommendations in this space, we really need to push for better data. The second was this push to raise awareness. So this idea that around 60% of dance teachers really hadn't had any kind of proper education on this, given that the majority of dance teachers work with children and young people, really struck me as an area that needed lots of work. And then education. So primarily for dance teachers, but also for students, other people who support those dancers. So, what are we doing about this? What's been done since 2018? So, I continue to work in dance teacher education. I deliver initial teacher training, CPD, on this topic. I've continued my collaborations with Dance UK and with the Royal Academy of Dance. And I made some new collaborations. So I started working with the ISTD on their kind of teaching units around this. And I also started working with the Royal Ballet School. So they had some data that they were keen for me to have a look at and make a start on kind of seeing where we're at in terms of the data side of this. And I came up with the kind of concept for the GuiDANCE project. And I spent many years trying and failing to get someone to fund it. So, fast forward to 2021, we got some funding, which was fantastic, and GuiDANCE was born. So, this was a collaboration between the RID, Dance UK, Royal Ballet School, and University of Exeter, where I'm based, and was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. So we were fortunate enough to have fantastic advisory groups attached to this project. So when I started this, I was really, really passionate about making sure that whatever we did kind of was grounded in what teachers needed and the experience of students. So this was a really kind of key part of this project. And we had 2 advisory groups attached to this. We had a dance teachers advisory group and a student advisory group. And they were involved right from the beginning of the project, helping to design survey questions, interview questions, all those kinds of things, and informing kind of what we were going to hang our ideas around in terms of practice-based things. So there was about 4 individuals in each of those advisory groups kind of volunteering their time and expertise, and you'll get to hear from some of them later on today, which I'm really excited about. So, what were we trying to do in the GuiDANCE project? We were essentially trying to take forward those 3 things that I ended the PhD with in my mind. So, the idea of developing data in this space, the idea of increasing awareness and education in this space, and the final kind of piece was this idea to, could we kind of co-create some sort of vision for what best practice should look like in the dance sector that we could take forward. So this was the goal. We had 18 months of funding, so there was a lot to do. So the project is kind of in 4 pieces. Part 1 and 2 were in collaboration with the Royal Ballet School. So this was really around, they had a lot of data to kind of look at, and for me, my kind of role was to sort of look at that data, see what was there, how we could, do even better in terms of what we're collecting, how we're collecting it, if we're going to be using this data to make some informed decisions. Alongside that, I did a review of practices and protocols. So this was This involved interviewing healthcare practitioners, artistic staff, about where kind of growth and maturation fitted in terms of their role. And then part 3 and 4, this is what we're going to kind of primarily focus on today, was firstly looking to kind of evaluate some of the education stuff that we had created. So fantastic, we'd created some CPD talks, that was a step forward. But what I was really interested in trying to find out was what teachers were taking away from that 2 hours of CPD, what they were able to do with that. Was it something that was meaning they could change their practice? Were there barriers which meant that they couldn't do that? I really wanted to understand how valuable that was and if we could make it better. So we did a survey, sort of a bigger scale version of the one we did back in 2016, and some interviews with teachers to kind of explore those things. And last but not least, we wanted to kind of, as I said, come back together as a collaborative and create some sort of vision for best practice based on what we had found out from all those other pieces. So, there was lots of stuff, but here's what I'm going to say are the kind of key things that I want to highlight for you today. So, there were lots of positives. There's definitely some areas of good practice happening, but this is certainly not across the board in the dance sector, so still lots of work to do. We had some good practice, but we also had some gaps. So, for example, we have some good CPD training, but we have some gaps around psychological development and well-being in terms of the content of that training. Access to training and education, definitely improving. And we've got some evidence of application starting to come through. So what are teachers doing with this information when they go back to the studio? And we have some improvement in terms of the data we're collecting in this space. Lots of areas for improvement though. So, 48% of dance teachers were still telling us that they had had no education or training on this topic. So, better than the 60% that we had in 2016, but still a way to go. So this really tells us that this is not seen as a core pillar of dance teacher education at this point in time. But my argument is that it should be. We have a lot of examples of a kind of one and done CPD model. So we're sitting teachers down for 2 hours and expecting magic to happen without doing anything further. So it's that kind of idea of how can we make that more effective. Teachers had all sorts of fantastic ideas around this. We talked about things like having a follow-up session a few months after the initial CPD. What questions do you still have? Have you gone away and tried to use this and come up against some problems? Those kinds of things. How can we help teachers to actually take this forward? There's much more support needed translating this knowledge to practice. That comes with some of that, and we will talk a lot more about that in workshop 1 later. And we need more information, more resources, and still much better access to this training. So, we had all this information from the different pieces of this project, and what happened was we came together in a room, all of the collaborators, the advisory group members, and tried to make sense of this. So this illustration is basically our little journey on that day, and where we came to in terms of some ideas around best practice. So, taking into account what we know we're doing okay, things that we know we need to do a lot more work on, what should we be aiming for in terms of best practice in this space? And this is what we came to. So you'll see this a lot today, hopefully. This is a sort of illustration of the guidelines that we came up with as a collaborative. This is what we think we should be aiming for in terms of best practice in growth and maturation in the dance sector. And there's all sorts of things here, some of which are sort of overarching aims for the dance sector as a whole. So things like having a better understanding of minimum and gold standards. So what kind of content should we be covering in initial teacher training? What are the basics we want all teachers to understand? And where can we take that? So this idea of, if we're covering all the basics in initial teacher training, we can then help teachers to build on that and advance it and really, encourage them to develop those skills further. And then a few things that we feel teacher training and education bodies need to commit to and kind of drive forward. So things like promoting that reflection and follow-up after CPD, like I was just talking about. So, then we moved on to the guidance network. So our kind of 18 months that we had on the guidance project finished, and there was a lot of enthusiasm from the collaborative in terms of, okay, we don't want to leave this here, we want to drive this forward, we want to take forward some of the things that we've proposed in those guidelines and see what we can do. So we developed the guidance network. So similar group of collaborators, fancy new logo, different funder, AHRC this time, and this funding was across 12 months, and we had a fantastic group of network members. So these largely are people who are volunteering their time and energy to this and expertise, and I'm really excited that so many of them are here today. So, don't want to go any further. What I'm just about to describe to you is what we're aiming to do as the Guidance Network. So basically we wanted to kind of capitalise on the momentum that we had, so coming off the back of the Guidance project. We wanted to try and convert some of these ideas into actual actions. We wanted to see if we could start to create some resources for dance teachers. Ooh, we've moved forward, fantastic. And actually kind of bring these things to life. And we wanted to set up a network which would support and sustain this work going forward. So research funding kind of only gets you so far, it's great to find stuff out, but how could we actually sustain this work happening across the guidance, across the dance sector? So what have we been doing? We've been very busy across this 12 months. 12 months is not very much time. So we've had a series of meetings. We decided to set some priorities. So we had this wonderful set of guidelines, but obviously you can't do all of those things at once. So it was a case of sort of having a think about where should we get started in this 12 months. And so we picked teacher training and accessible messages and sector-wide promotion and awareness. So that's where we started. We got some working groups together and people to really kind of drive forward our ideas in these spaces. So what have we created? We've created a network of individuals who are really passionate about making change in this space. We've got a fancy logo and a little bit of a social media presence going on. We have developed a repository. This is where we want to store all our resources. We want somewhere that's accessible for everyone to come and find that information, and we're going to build more and more on that. And I'll share a QR code for that on the next slide. We've also created a toolkit of resources for dance teachers and parents. This is something that Imogen and I will be talking about in workshop 1. And benchmark standards for best practice in growth and maturation in dance. So some kind of ideas around a kite mark system for this, and some case study examples of best practice in the sector. So that is what Erin and Maxwell are going to be talking about in workshop 2. And we've created this lovely event to share with you all. So hopefully the QR code works. There's also various posters and things around with this QR code on, so this is how you can access the repository. What we're going to share here, we're going to share some resources, toolkits, the latest papers, video clips, all sorts of things. At the moment, we've just got a few things on there, but watch this space. This is where we're going to be putting all of this information. And we're not done. So hopefully this is just the beginning for the network. And we really invite all of you today, if you're interested in getting involved with what we're doing, to join us and support the work that we're doing. We're officially launching our network today. We're going to share with you some of what we've created. And we also really want to get your input on where we should focus next. So there'll be various points, one in a minute and one later on today, where we ask for your input in terms of helping us to prioritise various things. And as I said before, we invite you to join us as part of the network. So the first part of that is a sort of agenda for change. So what we want as a dance sector is to commit to making change and doing some of these things between now and 2030. So we really want you guys to help us shape this going forward. Looks a little something like this. These statements, these ideas, are derived from the guidelines that we created as a network, so that's where they've come from. But there will be an opportunity on the voting for you to add some suggestions, ideas, if there's things you think we have forgotten that are important. So again, you'll see another QR code today. This invites you to vote on that agenda for change, so you'll get an opportunity to rank those things according to what you think we should really prioritise And we will ask you to reflect on that as we go through the day. So you don't have to do it now, but have a think on it, and then please do contribute to that. And at the end of today, I'm going to close the event by telling you what you've all decided on and hopefully what will be taken forward. So, I am pretty much done. Up next, we have a wonderful panel of GuiDANCE collaborators. So this is your opportunity to hear more in depth, that was a little bit of a whistle-stop tour, more in depth about the project, the different people who are involved and why they're involved. And thank you for listening, and yeah, looking forward to hearing more from all of you today.
Understand what I meant about Siobhan being a font of all knowledge in this area. I think you can see the singular dedication that she has to this area of work and area of practice, and hopefully given what's been going on in the media and all of our experiences in dance, we know how important and how valuable this work is. So I really just want to acknowledge again Siobhan's incredible work in this area, and really actually singular work in this area. When you look around for other researchers who are doing this work, she's the one, and it's really impressive. So many, many thanks. We are now going to move into the panel discussion. It's going to take us a few minutes to set up the chairs, and I wonder if it might be a useful thing to give people a quick comfort break. Yes. Okay, so let's have a quick comfort break, and we'll come back in 10 minutes' time to begin.